Close your eyes and try to imagine walking into the city of London in the year 1400. Not the London of red buses and glass towers, not even the London of Charles Dickens with its cobblestones and gas lights, but a medieval city of perhaps 60,000 souls, crammed inside ancient Roman walls, piled on top of itself, in a density of human life and human misery that is almost impossible to picture from the comfort of the world we live in today. You step through one of the city gates and the assault begins immediately. And it is total, and it is brutal, and it reaches every single one of your senses at once. The noise is overwhelming. Hammering, shouting, animals screaming, cartwheels grinding on stone, church bells from over 100 separate churches ringing at different intervals across the skyline. The crowds are so thick in the main streets that moving faster than a slow shuffle is simply not an option, and the people pressing against you from every direction represent every class, condition, and degree of human fortune that exists in the world of 1399 going into 1400. And the smell. We will get to the smell. And when we do, hold on tight, because the reality of life in medieval London in the year 1400 was something so far removed from the romanticized version of the Middle Ages that it might as well be a different planet. It was a city of staggering beauty and staggering cruelty, of extraordinary human achievement and extraordinary human suffering, existing side by side in the same narrow streets, sometimes in the same building, sometimes in the same body. And today, we are going in. Let's start with the streets themselves, because the streets of medieval London in 1400 were not the picturesque cobbled lanes of the tourist imagination. They were, in a very real sense, open sewers. The city had no centralized waste management system of any meaningful kind. Household refuse, animal waste, human waste, byproducts of dozens of trades including slaughtering, tanning, candle making, and dyeing. All of it ended up in the streets, in the gutters that ran down the center of each road, or in the Thames, which served simultaneously as the city's main water source and its primary sewage disposal system. Every household was technically required by city ordinance to maintain the street in front of their property, but enforcement was sporadic, and the fines for non-compliance were low enough that many simply paid them and went on dumping as before. The central gutter of a busy London street in 1400 carried a permanent flow of mixed liquid waste that defies polite description, and in summer, when the heat intensified every smell to its absolute maximum, contemporary accounts describe the stench of the city as detectable from several kilometers downriver, before you even came within sight of its walls. This was not an unusual city. This was not an especially badly run city. This was simply what an urban settlement of 60,000 people looked like before modern sanitation, and London was actually better organized than many of its European counterparts. Now let's talk about what was living in that filth alongside the people of London, because the city in 1400 was not inhabited solely by human beings. Rats were everywhere, and not the occasional shy rodent of the modern city, but bold, enormous, plague-carrying rats that moved openly through the streets, through the food markets, through the warehouses, and through the homes of rich and poor alike. Pigs were legally permitted to roam freely in certain parts of the city as an informal waste management system. They ate the garbage in the streets, which was genuinely useful, while simultaneously adding their own considerable contributions to the general sanitary situation. Dogs, horses, cattle being walked to slaughter, chickens, geese. The streets of medieval London in 1400 were a moving, bellowing, defecating mass of both human and animal life, and navigating them required a level of physical and olfactory resilience that we have simply lost. And in the walls of every building, in the straw of every mattress, in the folds of every garment not recently washed, which was most garments, most of the time, lived lice, fleas, and bedbugs in numbers that the modern mind genuinely struggles to comprehend. The Black Death had already visited London in 1348 and 1349, killing somewhere between a third and a half of the city's population in a single catastrophic wave, and by 1400, it had returned multiple times in smaller but still devastating outbreaks. The people walking those streets in 1400 lived with the permanent, background awareness that plague could return at any moment, that the swelling of a lymph node in the neck or armpit was a possible death sentence, and that the city they loved and inhabited was also a machine for producing the conditions under which epidemic disease thrived and spread. Let's go inside now, into the homes where the people of medieval London actually lived, because the housing of 1400 tells us as much about the brutal reality of this world as anything that happened in the streets. The majority of Londoners, the craftsmen, the laborers, the apprentices, the servants, lived in conditions of extraordinary density. A typical working-class household might occupy a single room, or at most 2 rooms, in a timber-framed building that leaned so far into the street above that the upper stories of houses on opposite sides of the road could practically touch each other, blocking out the sky entirely. These rooms were shared not just by immediate family, but often by apprentices, lodgers, servants, and animals. A cow or a pig kept indoors for warmth and security was not unusual in the poorer quarters of the city. Heating came from a central hearth, with no chimney in the oldest buildings, meaning that the smoke from the fire simply drifted upward and escaped as best it could, through a hole in the roof or through the gaps in the walls, coating everything inside with a permanent layer of black soot and filling the lungs of everyone who lived there with particulate matter from the moment they were born. Even in buildings with proper chimneys, which were more common by 1400, the combination of open fires, tallow candles, and limited ventilation meant that indoor air quality was something that would fail every modern safety standard by an enormous margin. Light was precious and expensive. Tallow candles made from animal fat were the standard for ordinary Londoners, and they were smoky, smelly, and dim, producing a guttering, yellowish light that was enough to move around by but barely enough to work or read by. Beeswax candles gave a cleaner, brighter flame, and did not smell of rendered fat, but they cost roughly 4 times as much as tallow, and for most of the city's population, they were a luxury reserved for special occasions. After dark, London was genuinely, profoundly dark in a way that is almost impossible to recreate in the modern world. And the streets after nightfall were dangerous not just because of crime, which was significant, but because of the simple physical hazard of moving through narrow, unlit, obstacle-strewn streets without being able to see your hand in front of your face. Now let's talk about food and health, because the diet of ordinary Londoners in 1400 was a study in the relationship between poverty, nutrition, and the absolute resilience of the human body under conditions of chronic deficiency. Bread was the foundation of every meal for the majority of the population. Coarse, dark bread made from rye or barley, dense and filling, but lacking many of the nutrients that a human body needs to function at its best over the long term. Supplemented with ale, with whatever vegetables could be grown in garden plots or bought cheaply at market. With occasional fish, London's position on the Thames made freshwater fish relatively accessible, and with salt pork or offal on better days, this was the diet that kept the working city alive. Fresh meat was expensive and consumed far less frequently by ordinary Londoners than the festive medieval feasts of popular imagination would suggest. Those feasts were the diet of the nobility and the church, not of the apprentice or the laborer. Malnutrition was chronic in the poorer quarters of the city, and its effects were visible everywhere, in the short stature of the population compared to modern averages, in the rotten teeth that were virtually universal by middle age, in the skin condition and eye problems caused by vitamin deficiencies, and in the simple fact that a working-class Londoner of 1400, who reached the age of 50, had already done something genuinely remarkable. Life expectancy figures for this period require careful handling. They are often quoted in ways that are misleading, but the brutal truth is this. If you survived childhood, which enormous numbers of children did not, you might live to 50 or 60 if you were fortunate and careful. But your body by that age would already bear the accumulated damage of a life lived in cold, damp, smoky, nutritionally marginal conditions in ways that a modern 50-year-old simply would not recognize. And yet, London in 1400 was also alive in ways that are genuinely breathtaking. It was a city of extraordinary craftsmen, of master builders raising stone churches of heartbreaking beauty, of merchants bringing silk and spice from the ends of the known world, of storytellers and poets and musicians filling the taverns with language and sound that still echoes down to us today. Geoffrey Chaucer had died just a few years earlier, in 1400, and his Canterbury Tales, full of London voices, London humor, and London humanity, had already begun its journey toward becoming one of the greatest works of English literature ever produced. The people of medieval London were not simply victims of their conditions. They were fully alive within them, finding joy and beauty and meaning in the gaps between the hardship, celebrating feast days with a communal exuberance that modern city life rarely